In the heart of the bustling city stood a hospital, a place where countless lives had been saved, and where sometimes the line between the living and the unknown had been blurred. Alex, an experienced emergency room doctor, was not a man who took the supernatural lightly. But one incident changed his views forever. It was a cool, moonless night. The clock struck 3 in the morning, and Alex found himself in the dimly lit basement of the hospital. He was tasked with getting a new gurney, as the previous one had been severely damaged by a violent patient during the night. The basement was a labyrinthine storage area filled with a chaotic array of medical equipment, spare beds and supplies. With a heavy sigh, Alex picked his way through the maze of medical artifacts, shining a flashlight into the darkness. The Pediatric Intensive Care Unit (PICU) was located on the 3rd floor, and at this late hour it was closed for the night, with no visitors. As he rummaged through the cluttered closet, his heart sped up when he felt a tentative tug on his shirt. At first he thought it was just snagging on some object, but then it happened again, more insistently this time, and he clearly heard a child's voice. Crystal clear and full of innocence. "I'm lost." Goosebumps ran down his spine, his heart pounding frantically in his chest. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that something otherworldly was happening. Startled, but with an inexplicable pull to his voice, Alex called out to his partner Chris, who was a floor above, excusing himself with the excuse that he needed help with the gurney. The urgency in the voice made Chris rush downstairs without a second thought. "What's going on, Alex?" asked Chris, concerned by the tremor in his partner's voice. Alex hesitated for a moment, not knowing how to explain what had happened. "I think I heard a child's voice, Chris," he finally admitted. Chris raised an eyebrow, looking at him skeptically, but willing to consider the idea. A child's voice, out here. At a time like this, Alex nodded solemnly. "It was so clear, so vivid." She said, "I'm lost." As Chris realized the gravity of the situation, the two doctors exchanged a knowing look. They had heard the stories, the rumors that went around among the hospital staff about unexplained occurrences, especially in the ICU and hospice. Alex wasn't the only one who had encountered something unusual. Nurses, junior medical staff, and even doctors told their eerie stories. With trepidation, they continued their search for a new gurney, their footsteps echoing in the eerily quiet basement. The voices died down, leaving an unsettling sense of uncertainty. Finally, they found a gurney, and as they began to wheel it out, the atmosphere became even heavier. When they reached the stairs leading to the main floors of the hospital, a faint chuckle echoed down the hallway. It was an unmistakable childish laugh, full of eerie innocence. Alex and Chris froze in place, their eyes darting around looking for the source of the ghostly sound. "Did you hear that?" whispered Chris, his voice shaking. Alex nodded, his throat dry as he tried to answer. "Yeah, I heard it." Before they could react, the laughter grew louder, more playful, like a child running in circles around them. Panic froze in their veins as they realized there was no logical explanation for the phenomenon. Flashlights illuminated the empty corridors with not a single living thing in them. But the laughter didn't stop. The medics exchanged looks full of horror, their instincts telling them to run from the unexplainable. They abandoned the gurney and rushed up the stairs. As they ascended, the laughter of the invisible child subsided. Back on the main floor, they gasped, their hearts still pounding frantically. They knew they had just witnessed something unfathomable, something that defied any rational explanation. A sense of discomfort lingered in the quiet, dimly lit hallways of Elmwood Manor, an aging nursing home that had seen several generations of residents. The place was always eerie on the night shift. John, a dedicated and somewhat superstitious caregiver, had been working at Elmwood Manor for years. He had grown accustomed to the strange phenomena that seemed to be supposed to occur on the night shift. That evening, he was tasked with setting the tables for the next day's meal, a procedure he had performed countless times. As John made his way down the empty hallways, the only sound was the soft shuffle of his footsteps on the linoleum. The night was quiet, and the occupants of the house slumbered peacefully in their rooms. It was during these quiet hours that the building seemed to come alive with its mysterious energy. As he approached one of the dining rooms, John glanced at the old television set in the corner. The screen was dark, reflecting the emptiness of the room. John paid no attention to it, focusing on the arrangement of silverware, plates and glasses on the tables. The atmosphere in the room was somber, the dim lighting casting long, eerie shadows on the tables. Suddenly, as he walked past the television, it came to life abruptly, and the sudden illumination made John jump. He froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. His rational mind tried to find an explanation. Perhaps it was a glitch or a timer. But the timing was too perfect, too unsettling. Shaking off his anxiety, John continued setting the table, deciding it was a strange but ultimately harmless coincidence. He carefully arranged the cutlery, and when he was done, he couldn't help but mutter to the room, "Thank you, but I'm done and I'm leaving." And at that moment the television turned off. Turning away from the table, he headed toward the service area, leaving the room behind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, but he didn't want to give in to his anxiety. After all, he had a job to do and he couldn't afford to let his imagination run wild. Walking back down the dark corridors, John couldn't help but think of the countless stories of strange occurrences he'd heard from his co-workers during the night shifts. It wasn't just TVs, but also unexplained sounds, doors that opened and closed on their own, and guests who claimed to see shadowy figures or strange people in their rooms. One case is particularly memorable. It involved a patient named Margaret who had been bedridden for several weeks. On one particularly quiet night, John approached her room, concerned that she was still awake even though she should have been resting. "Margaret," he whispered softly, "aren't you tired? You should get some sleep." Margaret's eyes, dilated with fear, darted about the room. "I can't," she answered in a trembling voice. "I can't sleep with so many people here." John looked around the room in confusion, but saw no one but Margaret in her bed. "Margaret," he said soothingly, "there's no one here but you and me. You must be mistaken." But Margaret shook her head, her frail hand pointing to the empty space around the bed. "No, John," she said in a trembling voice, "there are people around here. They're watching me." Goosebumps ran down John's spine as he walked out of Margaret's room, unable to explain what she had experienced. Over the years, he had heard similar stories from other residents that left him with a sense of unease that never went away. In the small town of Elm Ridge, nestled deep in the hills of Pennsylvania, there was a quiet, unassuming hospice that served as a haven for those experiencing the last moments of their lives. Here, dedicated medical professionals like Mary Johnson, a compassionate nurse in her early 30s, cared for and comforted patients in their final days. On one fateful evening, Mary was assigned to care for Theodore Simmons, a gentleman in his early 80s who was struggling with a terminal illness. His infirmity was evident and he was preparing to be discharged to hospice care at home. This was the second time Mary had visited him, and she had a great responsibility to make sure he was comfortable during this difficult time. As the clock showed deep into the night, Mary quietly entered Mr. Simmons' dimly lit room to check his vital signs. The room was decorated with family photos and mementos of a long and happy life. The elderly man lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored. Maria's gentle touch and soothing words brought him some comfort. However, this night was not like the previous ones. Watching his vital signs, Mary noticed that Mr. Simmons was mumbling incoherently in his sleep. His frail hands were fumbling restlessly with the sheets, and his eyebrows were furrowed, as if he had fallen into a deep slumber. Consumed with curiosity, Mary decided to gently wake him, concern written all over her face. "Mr. Simmons, are you all right?" Mary asked Mary quietly, her eyes full of sympathy. Startled out of his thoughts, Mr. Simmons blinked and focused his gaze on Mary's face. He was confused for a moment, but then smiled weakly. "Oh, Mary, I was just dreaming," he whispered. Mary leaned toward him, her voice gentle. "What did you dream, Mr. Simmons?" His eyes glistened with nostalgia, and he replied, "I dreamed of my younger days, Mary. Those times when I was with my friends, going to the bar and having fun. Those were some of the best times of my life." Mary couldn't help but smile as she realized that these dear memories were keeping him company in his dreams. She wished him pleasant dreams and left the room, finishing her nursing chores. A few more hours passed, and Mary, along with a colleague, left the room to pick up another patient. When they returned, they saw a disconcerting sight. All of their colleagues, including the senior nurses, were gathered around the computer screen, awe and disbelief written all over their faces. "What's going on?" Mary asked, asked Mary, feeling curious. Her coworker Sarah pointed to the screen, her voice trembling. "Look over here. Mary, this is Mr. Simmons' room." On the screen of the portable video camera in Mr. Simmons' room, Mary saw something that sent shivers down her spine. A multitude of spheres that looked like shooting stars swept across the room in a mesmerizing glow. They moved with grace, and their ethereal glow filled the room. Mary had seen individual spheres on camera before, but this was different. The number and brilliance of these spheres was unprecedented. Some coworkers even ventured into the room to investigate them. However, as soon as they entered the room, the spheres disappeared and reappeared when they left the room. By the time Mary and Sarah returned, the balloon show had stopped. Everyone was still trying to make sense of this unexplained phenomenon, sharing theories and guesses. Some thought it was just a technical glitch, while others couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual had happened. Mary couldn't help but think that Mr. Simmons' dream had somehow caused the mysterious orbs. She shook her head, dismissing the thought as absurd, and went on with her duties for the night. Minutes passed, and Mary was again drawn to Mr. Simmons' room. This time her attention was attracted by his movement. He sat up in bed, his weak figure swaying slightly as he tried to get up. Worried for his safety, Mary rushed into the room and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Simmons, what are you doing? You must stay in bed, my friends. You're disturbing them when you come in here. They get scared of you and disappear right away. We're going to play cards now. Get out of my room." In the heart of a decaying city block, amidst the ruins of a bygone era, stood a relic of the past, St. Augustine's Hospital. It was small, quaint, and as old as the hills. In fact, it was so small that the hospital's closure seemed inevitable, a decision dictated by the inexorable march of progress that had left the institution behind. The only unit still clinging to life in the dying hospital was the maternity ward. The few other clinics and offices left standing closed their doors. As the sun disappeared over the horizon, Nurse Sarah Mitchell began her nursing career in this disappearing bastion of healthcare. A young, determined woman with a heart full of compassion, Sarah found solace and purpose in this place. Her days were filled with cries of joy and tears of pain, as new lives entered this world and old ones left. One fateful night, as the clock ticked toward midnight, Sarah's world was to change forever. An emergency patient was brought into the labor and delivery ward, a pregnant woman who needed an emergency C-section. As Sarah found out, the patient was from out of town and came alone, unsupported. The urgency of the situation required immediate action, and a small team of nurses and doctors went to work preparing the operating room for surgery. Sarah, always calm and collected in a stressful situation, was ready for surgery. The surgery went smoothly, with the team working cohesively to bring a new life into the world. The patient, although visibly nervous, endured the ordeal with remarkable courage. As the surgeon's scalpel cut through skin and muscle, the room was filled with the rhythmic hum of medical equipment. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Lawrence, closely monitored the patient's vital signs. Then, the moment goosebumps ran down Sarah's spine, the patient's eyes glazed over and she stopped responding to Dr. Lawrence's questions. "Hey, are you okay?" asked Dr. Lawrence, concern evident in his voice. He repeated the question, growing increasingly anxious as the seconds passed. The room seemed to hold its breath, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Minutes passed like hours, and just as suddenly as it had started, consciousness returned to the patient. She blinked rapidly, as if coming out of a deep and disturbing sleep. Sarah watched, puzzled and intrigued. After the surgery was successfully completed, Sarah escorted the patient to the recovery room. It was deep into the night and only the quiet humming of the machines could be heard. The children, twins, were taken to the neonatal intensive care unit, leaving Sarah alone with the patient. The woman's name was Emily, a 23-year-old girl with a sense of vulnerability in her appearance. While engaged in Emily's postoperative care, Sarah couldn't help but mention the strange episode that had occurred in the operating room. "Emily," she began cautiously, "during the surgery, it was as if you had been withdrawn for a moment. You didn't react, and it made us worried." Emily's eyes widened slightly, and a concerned expression appeared on her face. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, and her voice shook. "I saw my grandmother in the operating room," she whispered. "I was so scared, and I asked her to hold my hand, but she said she couldn't touch me." Sarah furrowed her eyebrows in confusion. "Your grandmother." "But Emily, there was no one in the operating room but the medical team. Are you sure it wasn't a dream or hallucination?" Emily shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "No, it was real. I saw her clear as day. She was standing there in her old-fashioned dress as usual. She tried to comfort me, but she couldn't touch me." The rural hospital in which this gruesome story unfolds was located in the heart of the Ozark Mountains, where time seemed to flow more slowly and the nights were filled with silence. The hospital itself was an old, weathered building that had seen many joys and sorrows over the years. And on this night shift, it was about to witness something truly inexplicable. Sarah worked as a nurse in this quaint but understaffed hospital. The night was as quiet as ever when Sarah found herself standing alone in a dimly lit corridor, absorbed in the chore of charting patients. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a cold, clinical glow on the worn linoleum floor. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a cacophony of hurried, rumbling footsteps just behind her. Heart pounding frantically, Sarah instinctively turned around, expecting to see a patient in distress, or perhaps a doctor rushing to a call. But, to her shock, there was nothing there. The corridor was eerily empty, with not a living soul in sight. Sarah stood looking around, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had she imagined it? Could it be the result of fatigue and long work? Doubt gnawed at Sarah, making her question her own sanity. At that moment, Lucy, a petite Filipino colleague, came out of one of the neighboring rooms. She looked at Sarah with wide-open eyes and asked in a trembling voice, "Who's that running down the hall?" Lucy heard it too, footsteps, an inexplicable noise that made Sarah's heart pound. Sarah stared at her. "We both witnessed things neither of us could explain in the nights that followed." The unexplained phenomena continued. Footsteps rumbled in the empty corridors, as if someone or something was hurrying toward an unseen destination. Occasionally they heard a faint whisper, like a distant conversation that dissolved into thin air. It was unsettling, to say the least. And then came a night that sent shivers running down Sarah's spine. She was alone at the spreadsheet table, immersed in her work again, when she heard a voice. A soft, disembodied voice whispering her name, Sarah. The girl's heart raced and she froze, frozen to the keyboard. Sarah was alone and saw no one. The voice came again, more insistent this time, as if trying to get her attention. "Sarah!" Thoughts raced through her head. Sarah frantically looked around the empty hallway, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was crisp, clear, and he knew her name. Panic rose in her chest as she tried to figure out what was going on. Sarah gathered her strength and cautiously stepped out into the hallway, footsteps echoing eerily. "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no answer, just the unsettling silence of the empty hospital corridors. Lucy, who had become a constant companion on these anxious nights, soon joined Sarah, her eyes full of fear and curiosity. The girl told Lucy what she had heard, and she nodded solemnly, confirming that she herself had encountered similar, unexplained phenomena.